When you think about making your business accessible, you probably think about brick and mortar, things like wheelchair ramps and bathrooms. But that's just the beginning. Welcome to Expert Connections. I'm Julie Holton. In this ever evolving digital world, businesses must follow accessibility guidelines for virtual spaces. That means websites and, yes, even Zoom meetings. We put together a special panel for you, our legal and marketing connections expert. Joining me, John Mashney, an attorney at Foster Swift, Jesse Flores of Super Web Pros, Seth Getz of Symposia Labs, and Paul Schmidt of Uno Deuce Multimedia. Thanks to each of you for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having us, Julie.
Guys, we know that accessibility is the right thing to do. It's also a legal requirement. So, John, let's start with you. Can you give us a brief overview of what Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, what do businesses need to know?
So a number of years ago, the federal Congress passed the American with Disabilities Act, which for the most part meant that many buildings, sidewalks now are accessible to people with disabilities. However, in the last 10 years or so, there's been a movement to say that a business that has a web presence online, that web presence is considered a place of public accommodation, meaning it's open and available to the public. And now it is subject to the requirements that are in Title III of the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act. So there's not been very much guidance from the Department of Justice, which administers that act, in terms of in terms of some guidance like, hey, how does a business create a website that can be accessible to people with disabilities? And so courts have really determined that, number one, websites are subject to the ADA, and courts actually disagree on the extent to which that applies. So, for example, and some courts have said, if you have a website and a physical location, then your website is a place of public accommodation. And other courts have said, no, if you just have a website and your business is making goods or services for sale online, then you're subject to the restrictions or the obligations in the Americans with Disabilities Act. And what does that mean? It means you have to make your place of public accommodation accessible to people with disabilities. And when we look at disabilities online, one of the main ones is people who are blind. They have to be able to access your website in a way where they can do it through the readers that they have. And the main guidelines that people follow, because there aren't very many, there's no guidance from the Department of Justice, are these web accessibility guidelines, sometimes called WCAG standards, and they're being updated all the time. So that's the current lay of the land. States are even passing laws that govern this as well, but the main thrust is the Americans with Disabilities Act.
And John, we know, of course, lawsuits make headlines and businesses pay attention to these lawsuits. The DOJ, as you mentioned, has taken action against some big names recently: H&R Block, Carnival Cruise Line, number of universities. Who is most at risk for legal action?
Yeah, I would think particularly anyone who has a website and a retail location absolutely has some exposure here, and they should absolutely be working with usually their developers, their marketing people, to make sure that their websites are accessible or at least meet these WCAG standards. That's the current, both the DOJ and also plaintiffs' lawyers that's the standard that they're going to want businesses to meet.
And of course, we saw a lot of businesses kind of rush this move to digital with the pandemic, trying to take their in-person services or products and offering them online. Jesse, let's talk about what website accessibility actually means. John mentioned we're talking especially about those with visual impairments, those who are blind. What are we talking about on a website?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as John said, really the idea is to remove barriers so that anyone can use the internet. And certainly some sort of visual disability is probably the most common, but there are other kinds of physical and cognitive and auditory disabilities as well. And in some cases, you might even only be temporarily disabled. Imagine you break your arm, right? And how do you interact with your keyboard if you can't use your arms? Or I didn't used to use glasses, so as we get older, right, our bodies change, and so some things that maybe used to be easy aren't as much. And so the idea of accessibility really is about making sure that anybody who comes to your site, in whatever state they're in, is able to access it and interact with that content. And unfortunately, for too long, that just hasn't been the norm. And a big part of it is that, one, some of the direction that John said, it's not really clear what all the guidance are, and they change a lot. But there is a bunch of legacy code out in the internet that is not built with this kind of idea in mind. And the remediation itself can be both time consuming and expensive.
Jesse, I think it's important to point out that some of these things you're talking about too, we're talking about color contrast, the fonts being used, things that, perhaps, color contrast, for example, if someone maybe is colorblind, what is your website going to look like to this person? It's not just simply blindness, as you were talking about as well. Jesse, why are so few websites accessible?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons why, and certainly couldn't name all of them. Some of it is the legacy code that I've described before. I mean, this was not something that a lot of people, when they kind of got online and started thinking about the internet 20 years ago, they weren't thinking about, these kinds of things, right? A big part of it too is that many people, when they build their websites, they're using pre-built themes, pre-built plugins that themselves might not have been coded with these standards, but they've got this functionality that I really like. I really want to be able to do this particular thing, like book this thing or whatever the thing is, right? And so you've got this cool idea, but that software wasn't built in a way that was accessible. And so one of the most important things that I tell our customers in terms of accessibility is you've got to start when you're redoing a site or you're building a new site. You've got to start strong, choose good software from the beginning, vet the themes, vet the plugins, and really start to make sure that from the beginning, you're thinking about this at least going forward. And if you're starting a new project and you've got a lot of legacy code, because maybe it's not accessible, but it might be great for SEO, we've got to figure out ways to remediate some of that stuff as we get into it. But the reality is it can get expensive. The tools themselves can be kind of expensive, and really it's going to be kind of case by case basis until there are more standards that are more consistently enforced throughout the web.
So let's talk expense. Seth, just like we have the so-called green tax for sustainability, there is cost involved here. Are there affordable options, especially for small businesses, for accessibility?
Julie, as you're talking about, and you mentioned how making it accessible is the right thing to do. And John talked about how it's necessary from a legal perspective. I think it's fascinating how if you do it and do it right from a user experience perspective, it makes it better for everyone. A small example in the real world, but when they made ramps, the curbs into ramps, you know how much easier that makes it for me to take my kids for a bike ride? It's surprising, and it's a great thing. So it makes it better for everybody. So you look at this and say, if you design it right from the beginning, as Jesse was talking about, and do this with the user experience in mind. There's a steel case company over in Grand Rapids. A number of years ago, back in the 80s, they built a massive new world headquarters. It was a monument of a building. It was amazing. They poured millions of dollars into it, but they did not consider usability. And in 10 years, they deserted that building and sold it for pennies of a dollar because everyone hated to work in it. So I look at it and say, you've got to come at this thing from the perspective of the user experience. And to do that user experience, you've got to have someone look at it. We used to think of websites as being, you've got to make it beautiful and then code it. You've got to add an additional step in there now. You've got to make it beautiful, look at the user experience, and then code it accordingly. And there are getting to be tools out there that will help you to identify these different things. Tools that will look at it and say, here's the contrast that you have on these pages. It needs to be at this level. And when you make it better that way, it makes it better for everybody.
Paul, with so much business being done right now through video, how do we make sure to prioritize accessibility?
Well, actually, it's an interesting situation because it's a lot of the platforms are making it easier to at least provide the closed captioning at a basic level, almost automatically. YouTube, Facebook, all the social platforms are offering closed captioning as part of the whole process. Now, to really get accurate on it, there's other platforms you can use, such as Rev, that can really dive deep into making sure everything is spelled and looked is accurate on your video, but you at least get a chance to start there. But the other aspect of accessibility I want to touch on, especially when we're talking about Rev, is ESL and people that do not use English as their main language. That's another accessibility feature that a lot of folks don't talk about, especially for those in populations that use a different language other than English. And so these platforms such as Rev offer that as well. And that's another huge accessibility functionality that spreads to different audiences. And then for the other accessibility function is audio descriptions. Now, Netflix is really big on this, and being able to have that situation for those who are sight impaired to be able to engage with your media from that situation. And as was brought up before, there are costs to this, because you're adding to video or creating another situation in which you have to create an accessible functionality for differing audiences. But as Seth mentioned, that means everybody gets to enjoy the media that you're producing and putting out there.
John, one last question. What steps can businesses take to prevent legal problems?
So first step is, if you're hiring someone to build a website for you or a web developer, make sure that built into that agreement is compliance with these WCAG standards, the most up-to-date version. And second is, if you do receive a letter from a plaintiff's attorney on behalf of someone with a disability, make sure you take it seriously. There are serious consequences, including paying all the attorney fees for the person with the disability. So make sure you take those seriously and you work with an attorney who has experience in those matters.
Thanks so much to all of our experts. We want to make sure you have access to additional resources. So just head to WLAJ.com/expert connections and click the link for Legal Connections.